goodness. By the end of the day tomorrow, it will be uploaded. All right, now I'm going to kick it over to our friends at TNTP.
Everyone, a quick note, I just put a link to a Nearpod in the chat. If you haven't already, go ahead and join that lesson. I will not be sharing my screen for this because once you open the Nearpod link, as I'm going through the presentation, it'll automatically just kind of update on your screen as well. So I'll give everybody just a moment to do that. I see 14 people have joined my presentation, so we're waiting on a few more. All right, as we have people continuing to join, I will kick us off. Thank you so much for being here with us this afternoon. This is our second session in our series about the science of reading. Today we're focusing on knowledge and vocabulary. My name is Nimisha Thakore. I'm here with TNTP supporting with kind of just advancing the science of reading and knowledge of that across the board. My background is I spent a lot of time focused just on social studies, actually. So I feel really passionately about literacy in social studies. And I'm super excited to talk about knowledge today because that's social studies. So I'm super excited to be here with you guys. And I will kick it off to, I believe my colleague Kaitlin is on the call. Kaitlin?
Hi, everyone. My name is Kaitlin McDermott, and I'm actually live in Dallas, but I'm with you guys today from Connecticut. And my background is in school leadership, and I have a real passion for literacy, studied that in grad school, and have been pushing all of my school leaders to follow the science of reading in several school districts over the past 16 years.
Thank you. And our third partner in this work is Kenna McCorder. She will be joining us a little bit later, I believe. I don't think Kenna's on the call yet. Quick note, this is mostly for Kaitlin. My internet has been very spotty and I'm joining right now via my cell phone's personal hotspot. So just in case I get kicked off for any reason, I'm going to put Kaitlin in charge to continue the presentation. All right, Kaitlin, great. Okay, so our goal today is to walk away with a few key understandings and kind of see them living out through some examples and some research. One, we want to understand the value of exposing young students to complex content and ideas. We also want to walk away understanding the role content knowledge plays in reading comprehension. How word learning is most efficient when students understand context, and how leveled reading can create and result in some inequities if we're not careful about it. So we're going to dive right in. Another quick note, we are using Nearpod today, as I mentioned. Some of you may be familiar with Nearpod, but I just wanted to make a quick plug. If you've never used it, there's a free version of it that I recommend leveraging in your classroom if you're interested in this kind of thing. It just makes like collaborative presentations a little bit easier. And everything that I put in this presentation today can be done on the free version as well. So just plugging that if you want another resource for virtual learning. All right, we're going to kick off our time together making the connection between knowledge building and equity. So let's build a little bit on the first session a couple weeks ago, which was around phonological awareness and phonics. So in that first session, we focused a lot on those green strands of Scarborough's rope down at the bottom of this image. Sounds, letters, and words. But there is a whole other element to Scarborough's rope, the purple and blue strands at the top around language comprehension, which is where we're going to be living today for the next hour and a half. One of these language comprehension components is the heaviest hitter. And obviously by the title of this session, we know it's going to be knowledge. It influences, like what kids know and how much knowledge they have influences all of these other strands of the language comprehension part of Scarborough's rope. So their vocabulary, sentences, connections, their ability to get the gist of a text. So I just wanted to make that connection to how are we kind of building on learning from the previous session if you attended. So let's start with reflecting on a quote. What you see on the slide here is an excerpt from an article by Natalie Wexler, who wrote The Knowledge Gap, if you've read that. And this is from an article called Elementary Education Has Gone Terribly Wrong. If you're interested in this, when you get the materials afterwards, there will be a link to the full article if you want to read the whole thing. Kaitlin, can I get you to read this quote out?
Yes. What if the medicine we have been prescribing is only making matters worse, particularly for poor children? What if the best way to boost reading comprehension is not to drill kids on discrete skills, but to teach them as early as possible the very things we've marginalized, including history, science, and the other content that could build the knowledge and vocabulary they need to understand both written texts and the world around them?
Thank you, Kaitlin. I want you to take a second to just think about that, let that like simmer in your mind, and think about these two questions here. Why might making the shift to building knowledge be so important? And at the same time, why can that shift be really challenging for district schools and teachers to make? Take a few seconds to think about that, and then when I go to the next slide, you'll have the chance to share some of your thoughts via Nearpod. All right, you should see a collaborate board on your Nearpod. You can go ahead and just type directly in there and see your responses to these questions pop up. You can also read other people's responses, and if you strongly agree with one of them, there's a little heart in the bottom of the note. You can just click that to show that you like and you agree. So let's take a couple of minutes to share our thoughts via this collaborate board. I'm loving some of these responses. One that really resonated with me, I don't know who wrote this, so feel free to jump in if you want to elaborate. But somebody wrote, discrete skills seem easy to align to district and state assessments, whereas building knowledge feels less directly correlated to desired outcomes. That super resonated with me. I come from the last big district I worked for, very test prep heavy and really focused on like driving towards what's tested. So that just like really, that's like an uphill battle sometimes to climb. Does anyone else want to share out either something you wrote or something you see here on this Collaborate board that really resonated with you?
Nimisha, something else that resonated with me was what knowledge is the most important.
Thank you all for sharing. I wanted to just ground us in this idea. We're going to dig into a few more aspects of this, but to ground us in this idea that knowledge building is important because it allows our kids to access complex texts, but also, and I think a couple of the comments here got at this, it's an issue of equity, right? Our most marginalized students, somebody said something here about it helps kids connect to experience things they haven't personally experienced. That's exactly it, right? Like we might be teaching many students who haven't had the chance to travel around the world, or I remember when I was teaching, I was eating with chopsticks one day and my students were flocked around me and they were like, what are you doing? Because they'd never experienced it. So for students especially who don't have the means or the access to all of those kinds of experiences, it's even more critical that we help build up their content knowledge to access texts. Okay, so just to really hammer home this point, the effect of knowledge on reading comprehension is quite strong. And this statistic just kind of helps illustrate that. General cultural knowledge correlates about 0.5 with reading comprehension test scores. So if you're not like a statistics person, which I had to look this up, I'm not either. A solid 1 is like a strong a 1-to-1 correlation. So a 0.5 is pretty strong. That means that the more general cultural knowledge kids have, the stronger their reading comprehension will be in general. And this correlation is about the same as what we see between parents' heights and their kids' heights. So that's just kind of helps understand how critical this knowledge building piece is. So before we jump into more research, let's briefly pause and talk about what we actually mean when we talk about knowledge building through text in particular. And I want us to get a sense of what this can look, sound, and feel like in an actual K-2 classroom. So what we're going to do in just a moment is take 5 minutes to read as much as we can of an article that'll pop up on the next slide about a second grade classroom in Nevada. As you are reading through the first part of this article, be thinking about these 3 questions. What are your first impressions of this classroom? What are students learning and who is engaged? And then how are second graders able to tackle complex texts and ideas? We'll do 5 minutes of independent reading, and then when we come back together whole group, we'll separate into some small breakouts where you'll be able to discuss these questions with a few other folks. Are there any questions about what we are doing? Okay, let's take 5 minutes. You won't get through the whole thing. It's long. Just read as much as you can at your own pace. All right, that was 5 minutes. Go ahead and pause however far you got. We're going to pop into some breakout rooms of anywhere from 3 to 5 people in each breakout. And in your breakouts, you'll have a few minutes, about 3 minutes to discuss these questions. You don't have to go in any kind of order, just have an authentic conversation. What are your impressions of this second grade classroom? How are students engaged? What are they learning? And then how are you seeing evidence of second graders able to tackle some complex text and ideas? All right, Kim, I think she's gonna put us into breakouts. All righty.
Did anyone not get a breakout room invitation? I'd love to hear from a couple of folks, kind of what you talked about in your group and what's kind of resonating with you from this example.
This is Kristy. My team was wonderful. As we got the notice to go out of the room, they all voted for me to be the spokesperson. So good job for my breakout group, but I couldn't say no. So we really focused on the who are you to decide what they can and can't access. So, thinking of the just providing opportunities to tackle that text complexity and to really engage with similar content and not predetermining and making judgments about who can access that learning opportunity and who can't. That was one piece.
Let's hear from one other group. All right, I'm gonna call on, I was in her group, so I'm gonna call on Melissa Schneider. Can you share what you shared about mindset? That was really powerful.
I said it's not really the kids that have to change, it's adults, it's our mindset, because we've decided what kids can do and we actually limit them more than they would ever limit themselves.
Thank you for sharing, and I'll put you on the spot. And just imagine, imagine you're the parent of one of the second graders in this class, and they come home from school and you ask them around the dinner table, like, what did you learn in English today? Imagine the conversations that are going to pop up because of the way this student was engaging with learning and difficult content and having dialogue with her peers, right? And compare that to if your second grader was in an English classroom that was heavily just skills focused, right? And you ask them, what did you learn in English that day? They might say how to find the main idea, end of conversation, right? I've never met a second grader who's super jazzed about screaming from the mountaintops about how to find a main idea. So this is just to emphasize that, yes, there's a lot of research and a lot of science behind why knowledge building is important, but putting all that aside for a second, it's also just a more fun and engaging way to teach and to build confidence in our kids. So we don't want to lose sight of that aspect as well. Okay, now let's talk about some of the research. So some of you may be familiar with this study, the baseball study. So we've known, or researchers have known for a long time, that knowledge building does play a role in reading comprehension. But what we haven't really known is how and to what extent knowledge building influences reading comprehension. So an example that kind of illustrates that gap is, in the past, a lot of high school English teachers have been trained to believe that, before I'm able to start digging into Romeo and Juliet, I need to make sure I spend a ton of time teaching my kids about the Renaissance and about the Globe Theater for them to be able to access the text. That's kind of where our understanding of knowledge building has lived. But there's a lot more nuance to it than that. So this baseball study, in 1988, these researchers, Recht and Leslie, did a study where they had a bunch of 7th and 8th graders read a short text about baseball. And then they gave them a reading comprehension test. And they tested them in a variety of ways. They had them verbally summarize. I think they had them reenact and illustrate what they took from the text. So they're trying to gauge how much are you getting from this text about baseball. And they grouped the students into these 4 categories that you see here. There were students who had a high reading ability and also happened to just know a lot about baseball already. And then there were students who had a high reading ability but did not know a lot about baseball. Then we have our students with a low reading ability and high knowledge of baseball. And finally, we have students with low reading ability and low knowledge of baseball. So I want you to take a second and just pop in the chat. What would you expect to see in the results on these reading comprehension tests? How would you rank each of these 4 groups of students from highest performing to lowest performing? So it seems like many of us are already familiar with this. So thank you, Brittney, for putting an answer based on pretending as if you didn't know. But I did see a couple of answers that said high reading ability, both of the high reading abilities would be up at the top. That's actually not what ended up happening here. The two highest performing groups were the two high knowledge groups. So those two that were on the left-hand side. So students who had high knowledge of baseball, but low reading ability still did pretty significantly better than students who had a high reading ability, but low knowledge of baseball. And even the differences in the high reading ability and low reading ability in the blue and green columns here is statistically insignificant. And kind of same thing, there's little difference in the performance of the two low knowledge groups, whether or not they had a high or low reading ability. So this kind of helps reveal to us again that content knowledge can give kids a huge step up, right? And this also helps us recognize that when we have students who aren't performing well on reading comprehension assessments, it could be because of the skill, but it could also be because they don't have that content knowledge, right? We can't just assume that it's skill. Because if we give them something they know a lot about, they might perform a lot better. So this kind of just goes to show that we can't just focus on those skills, right? Currently in American classrooms, kids are spending maybe 5% of their day on science and maybe 5% on social studies in elementary school. They're spending almost half of their day, 47%, in English classes. If those English classes are only focused on practicing reading strategies and skills, we're going to end up with a lot of kids in these like yellow and orange bars of this graph, right? We have to make sure that we're balancing building their content knowledge with giving them those reading strategies that's going to allow them to access more complex texts. So here's another quick example of a different study that showed something similar, but added on a layer of socioeconomic status. So the key takeaway here is that a student's knowledge is often impacted by their socioeconomic status. And somebody mentioned this in the collab board earlier, and we kind of highlighted it. This is where the connection between knowledge and equity becomes really apparent. So in this 2014 study, it tested the background knowledge, a study on background knowledge tested pre-K students' comprehension on texts about birds. And they found significant gaps between the low SES students and the higher SES students in their reading comprehension. They found that the more affluent students scored higher because they happened to have a lot of additional knowledge, prior knowledge, background knowledge about birds. So they did the same test again, but this time they gave students texts about a fictional species called wugs. And nobody knew anything about wugs because they're not real. When they gave kids a text about wugs, the gap between the higher SES students and the lower SES students kind of disappeared. So what does that show us, right? That shows us that when we level the playing field in terms of content knowledge, it allows us to level the gaps that we might see in comprehension. I'll pause there for a second. Are there any questions or reflections that anybody wants to just take the space to name? I see a great question in the chat. So why don't our assessments reflect this knowledge? Susan, can you say a little bit more about your question? And then I'd love to hear from anyone else in the group if you have thoughts on that.
Well, your point with the low socioeconomic, and they use something that leveled the playing field like a make-believe animal, but a lot of our assessments on reading comprehension, reading passages are, nonfiction about knowledge of the world. So why don't we fix our assessments? Does that make sense?
Yeah, does anyone, I mean, yes, like rally cry, but does anyone want to respond to that or have any thoughts aside from like, yes, Susan?
Well, I think it also depends on what we're trying to measure and how we're using those assessments, I guess. Because if we really want to measure strategy usage, then we need to control the text so that is out of the equation. But if we do want to measure background knowledge and its impact, then we need to have passages that might be giving us information about that. So it's kind of political, I guess, but it depends on what we want to measure.
And I agree with you, Caryn, but I just want to ask something, because literacy strategies are so tied to our background knowledge. If the I don't know if that assessment, if it's about real knowledge of the world, will even assess, I don't think it's a fair assessment. Because that background knowledge is going to help them read. They're going to know vocabulary. We can't assess skills and compare two kids to each other if they don't know the background knowledge of that the passage in that assessment. You know what I mean?
I think you're bringing out a really good point that we're not going to be able to solve for in this time, but you're like, the thing that you're naming, I think that I hear you naming, is that when we look at assessment results, particularly for like English tests, reading tests, what we often do, at least I'm in Texas, what we often do with the state standards in Texas is look at mastery by standard and just go with that and plan our reteach plan by standards. And we go like very gung-ho in that direction when we haven't actually stopped to think like, was this text accessible for my students and why or why not, right? So there's this nuanced level of thinking that has to go into our data analysis practices as well, as long as the tests are the way they are, right? So thank you for asking that question. I love that.
I think I'd love to just point out too, I had the opportunity to go to Plain Talk Literacy Conference and hear from Tim Shanahan, and he talked about reconceptualizing reading instruction. And he actually addressed the issue of assessment and how assessments lead us to believe that they're able to measure standards, but they're not. At a minimum, what the assessments are able to do is tell us in general, can this student read and comprehend grade level text or not? That is about all it can do for us. And so I do think, I mean, there's just so many, your question at the beginning about what makes this shift hard, like everything makes it hard, right? Our teachers feel pressure to perform a certain way on NSCAS. Our teachers are pressured by district personnel to have standards-based learning targets, which set a narrow focus for a text, and they don't allow text to be at the center and allow kids to really derive everything that you can get from a piece of text. I mean, there are just so many issues related to this that make it really, really difficult. But for me, when I think about this whole idea about building knowledge, I like to think about it beyond assessment. Like assessment matters, yes, but the power in building knowledge also has to do with how our kids function as citizens of our world, right? If we deny them the opportunity to build knowledge, we're denying them the opportunity to really participate fully in our world.
Yeah, thank you
I
for
totally agree with that. Oh, am I talking over someone?
Go ahead.
I put in the chat too, I listen to a podcast frequently, and I heard Jared Miracle from Curriculum Matters speaking about the assessment issue and sort of fixing like state assessments, accountability assessment. And he, one of the ideas that he talked about was kind of that concept of you have your cold read and your hot read. Well, maybe we need to go kind of somewhere in the middle and align some of the topics by grade level and things like that, so that we know that students have that exposure to the knowledge building before they would get to that assessment, but not too much exposure to that. But I totally agree with what Brittney is saying. I think honestly, we have to, in public education, we have to set our vision and what we want for kids. Big picture, like what we want for their lives. Do we want doors open for them? Well, then we have to go for that regardless. So I think we just have to make that our mission and let the other things take care of themselves.
I think that's great that what Brittney and you just said, and I'm just going to say one more thing about this. In the early days, and some of you are as old as I am, well, maybe not that old, but in my era, and you remember the first days of Reading First, and when we did get some of the best professional development that we've ever gotten, we knew how to teach reading so much better, but we sacrificed the time in the lower grades of science and social studies learning that is coming back to bite us now. And so that was one thing I wish I could go back and change about all that. We learned a lot, but the knowledge piece and building knowledge was missing from that. And we can't go back, but that's why my passion is sharing.
I agree with that too. And that's, I think, the knowledge building has to be focused knowledge building. And I think that's what's so powerful too with some of the curricula that are available now, is we're also giving them so much power and leverage in other content areas. So they get multiple benefits. So yeah, totally agree with you. Hear what you're saying.
Yeah, thank you guys. That was a beautiful, robust discussion. Let's look at a couple more like different examples about how knowledge helps readers. So knowledge can help readers make inferences and resolve ambiguity. Let's look at two different examples of how that might play out. Let's talk about making inferences first. Let's take a look at this this sentence, I guess. John's face fell as he looked down at his protruding belly. Invitation specified black tie, and he hadn't worn his tux since his own wedding 20 years earlier. I want you to take 30 seconds to pop into the chat what's happening in this passage. I think my favorite response is John's rocking the dad bod. Love it. John is suffering from COVID-15. Yeah, we all kind of are able to infer here that John has gained weight in the last 20 years and is not going to fit into his tux. The author of this passage did not have to spell all of that out. We were able to kind of fill in some of those gaps because of the connections we can make based on our prior knowledge. This is a simple example, but we know that a tux, like we immediately associate that with clothing without having to think about it, right? We also might immediately associate the span of 20 years, getting older, with gaining weight, right? We also might just be familiar with some of those tropes and sayings that like we're used to, right? About like the older, I don't know, the older, I know I'm getting older and gaining weight every day. So we're able to fill in a lot of those gaps, and authors, when they're writing many of these texts, are assuming that readers can make those inferences, which is why they're not going to spell everything out all of the time. So let's look at an example of how knowledge can help us resolve ambiguity. Let's take a look at this sentence. John walked down the steps with care. Janine looked him up and down while she waited. Finally, she said, well, I'm glad I've got some fish in my purse. What's happening in this passage? Take 30 seconds to pop it in the chat. This one's a little trickier. We can't just make inferences right away, right? We have to like pause and think, why is she talking about fish in her purse? Even if your brain maybe wasn't able to make this knowledge connection, what happens to your understanding of this passage if I say that many people connect tuxes with looking like a penguin? Right now, you might not have made that connection, but now that I said that, and I didn't even explain why, right? I just said tux penguin, and many of you were like, oh, okay, I get it, right? Janine's making fun of him for waddling like a penguin and making this sarcastic joke about having fish in her purse, right? But we would have to know and be able to like kind of draw on that connection of tux to looking like a penguin to penguin eat fish, right? Like we're making some jumps here. And if our students don't have those kind of like connections to make, they're going to miss out on some of the meaning in texts like this. Another way that knowledge helps readers is by freeing up working memory by chunking information. Okay, I showed you that slide too quickly. We're going to do a quick, another kind of just like quick experiment to experience on our own, like what that chunking can feel like. I'm going to show you a list in just a moment that you already saw. I'm going to give you 10 seconds to read over the list and then just try to remember as many as you can in 10 seconds. All right, that was 10 seconds. You don't have to put anything in the chat, but just try to think back. How many can you remember? Now we're going to try it one more time. I'm going to show you a second word list for another 10 seconds. And then again, you're just going to try to remember as many as you can. That was 10 seconds. Think about how many you can remember. Now, I'd love to see in the chat, or if you'd like to just pop off mute to share, that's fine too. Which list 1 or list 2, were you able to more easily remember and why? 2. Why do we think that is?
We have those acronyms mapped in our brains.
Yeah. Both lists are just like at first glance a series of letters, right? But we have connections in our minds to these series of letters in list 2, right? When you see CNN, your brain is immediately, without even thinking about it, just like making that connection to a news channel. FBI, organization of people, CIA, NCAA, right? We're immediately making those connections, which frees up our working memory. Like we don't have to think about those connections. Our brain just does that automatically, right? So if we were seeing these words in a larger passage that might be more complex, these things aren't going to hold us up. We can like quickly make meaning of them and move on to like understand the broader gist of the text. Are you guys seeing a question on your screens? Okay, great. Let's take a couple minutes, just jot down some reflections based on all of these sort of like quick exercises we just did and the conversation you've heard so far. What are the implications of all of this research on reading and helping our kids store and process information? for the sake of time, I'm going to keep us moving. Sorry to cut off anyone who's still mid-typing. But somebody responded, they have to have knowledge to hook the words to, which I love the way that's stated. And that kind of like directly goes into this final point here. The three things we just experienced were that knowledge helps readers make inferences, helps readers resolve ambiguity, and helps readers chunk information. All of that together builds what we call schema. And you can think of kind of knowledge and schema as a spider's web. So a spider's web that has more connections and kind of more, that's more intricate, like the one you see here on this slide, it's going to be stronger. And because it's stronger, it can catch more bugs, right? Things are going to stick and stay in that web. Whereas if we have kind of a loose web with some strands falling off here and there, things aren't going to stick and catch as much. So the more knowledge we have, the stronger our schema or web, and the more, when we get new information, the more we can have that stick or kind of hook onto understandings that we already have, even if those understandings might not be tightly connected, right? Like if we have something to anchor new learning on, we can make more meaning of it and kind of retain it in our minds. Okay, we are going to skip this question for the sake of time because we've already talked quite a bit about it. Everything we just experienced kind of helps us define the connection between knowledge building and equity. If we want to make sure we're being equitable to all of our students, regardless of kind of the experiences they've had before they come to us, knowledge building is going to be a key part of that. All right, now let's talk about vocabulary. There is a tight relationship between knowledge building and vocabulary. And we know that vocabulary is a huge part of how kids can comprehend a text. So take a moment to read both of these quotes. They're from various studies, but they're also embedded in the 2021 Nebraska Essential Instructional Content for ELA. Just take a minute to read over them. So these quotes just emphasize, right, that vocabulary is important, obviously, but it's also tied to building knowledge. So we're going to look at kind of the relationship between those two things with another example. So I'm going to read this passage out to you, and as I'm reading it and you're kind of following along, just be thinking about, what do you learn about Eliza from this paragraph? What's special about the book Eliza wrote? And then what's the main idea of this passage? When she was 26, Eliza bought tickets to few had ever been there. Eliza wrote for the back home. She loved sharing the things she saw, such as, and the. Eliza even wrote a book, the first about. When Eliza went back to, it wasn't long before she started thinking about again. She decided to visit her older brother who was working in Eliza across the ocean. Just give me a thumbs up if you feel like you learned something about Eliza from the first paragraph. If we ask kids, what did you learn about Eliza from the first paragraph? They might say she's 26. She wrote a book. They can answer that question, right? Let's look at the second question. What is special about the book Eliza wrote? Could you answer that? Give me a thumbs up or thumbs down. Seeing a thumbs up and a maybe. Kids might be able to say it was the first something, right? It's like special because it's the first. right? So kids can kind of get away with answering those first two questions, even if they have all these gaps in vocabulary. What if I asked you to summarize the main idea of the passage? Can we do that? Does anyone feel like, yeah, I know what she's talking about? No, yeah. So when students, I love this example because it shows that if you're only asking questions like these first two, students might say things that sound right, and you might start thinking they're getting it, even if they don't understand all of these words that are not included here, right? But when you ask them to synthesize, like put the pieces together and tell me overall, what is this passage about? That's when you really start to see what a barrier to comprehension lack of access to vocabulary can be, right? So I'm gonna skip that. Let's look at this passage again with the words included. Kaitlin, since I see you on my screen, can you read this passage out with all of our vocabulary?
Man, I didn't practice my read aloud skills today. When she was 26, Eliza bought tickets to faraway Alaska. Few tourists had ever been there. Eliza wrote reports for the newspapers back then. She loved sharing the fascinating things she saw, such as huge glaciers, spouting whales, and the native people. Eliza even wrote a book, the first guidebook about Alaska. When Eliza went back to Washington, it wasn't long before she started thinking about traveling again. She decided to visit her older brother who was working in Japan. Eliza sailed across the ocean.
So we're going to pop into some quick breakout rooms one more time. And in your small groups, I'd love for you to talk about kind of the different feelings you had when reading the passage for the first time with a bunch of words missing, and then seeing it for the second time with all of those words filled out. How did it feel for you the first time around to read that passage without key vocabulary? How do you think it would feel for your students? And then what does this mean for our reading instruction? So we'll do 2 minutes this time around in breakout rooms, and then we'll come back to share out whole group. I will let Kim send us off to breakouts. All right, so we can see kind of from that example, one, how important vocabulary building is, but also that when we take the time to build students' knowledge and vocabulary, we're not just making them better readers, we're giving them, I think someone made this point earlier, I think it was Brittney, I forget how you said it, but like we're making them better citizens, right? We're allowing them to access information that might otherwise be unavailable to them. So you might be wondering, like, how on earth do we teach kids like every word ever, right? Like, when there's no way we can explicitly teach kids all of the vocabulary words they would need. The way we expand kids' vocabulary is through knowledge building, which is through texts. So they're kind of two sides of the same coin. Reading or listening to a series of texts on the same topic can yield as much as 4 times the vocabulary growth. So we don't have to do like Freyer models for every time we're doing a vocab word. If they're reading several texts on a topic that they're diving deeply into, they're going to accumulate new vocabulary much quicker and much more efficiently than they might have otherwise. So to kind of come back to that spider web analogy, the stronger schema they have, so the more knowledge they have, the stronger their web is, the more new vocabulary is going to stick to previous understanding as they come across it. Especially because we're going to see in just a moment, many new words they're encountering mean the same thing as other words they already know. So we want to make sure that we're not just focusing on like vocabulary building, but doing it in conjunction with building deep knowledge about whatever topic they might be studying. So you are all probably fairly familiar with this, but I wanted to quickly go over kind of the 3 tiers of vocabulary. Tier 1 is our basic words. They're not considered challenging for most kids. Obviously for English language learners, that's going to look a little bit different. But tier 1 words are usually not those that we would like explicitly teach in school. Tier 3 words are highly domain specific words. So lava, circumference, legislature, things that you would learn explicitly in like a science or social studies, like domain specific class. Tier 2 words are those more academic words that often mean the same thing as other words kids might know. And this is where to get kind of the biggest bang for our buck, this is where we want to spend a lot of time kind of exposing kids to a variety of tier 2 academic words. So a student may not, so just to give you an example, a student may not be exposed to all of the tier 3 words, all the domain specific words they need to access a particular passage. But if they have enough tier 2 knowledge, they can access more of that complex text. So let's say a student in class, maybe they read about turtles and other like sea creatures in a unit in their English class. And then maybe on the state test at the end of the year, they have a passage about the African, like the Sahara Desert or something. There are going to be specific domain 3 words in that passage about Africa that they don't know, but there might also be several other tier 2 words like species, habitat, environment, that they will be able to access because of their learning about turtles, right? Because of kind of that same topic. So that's just a quick example of how tier 2 words can support understanding. So now you see that same passage about our good friend Eliza. I'd love for you to take a minute to those blue bolded words that we saw earlier that we filled in the gaps for, read through them and highlight all of those blue words that you would identify as tier 3. So those highly domain specific words. Take a minute to do that and then we'll talk about the implications. Sorry to cut anybody off if you were having fun highlighting. But here on this slide, we see in orange is our tier 3 words, blue are our tier 2 words. If you knew as a student, if you knew the tier 2 words, so all the blue words, but you weren't super familiar with some of the tier 3 words, the orange words, could you still understand the gist of this passage? You can just give me a thumbs up or thumbs down. Yeah. So this again just kind of like drives home that point that if we make sure that we're exposing our kids to a lot of those tier 2 words, obviously they're going to get tier 3 words as needed. But if we're making sure we're exposing them to tier 2 words, they're going to be able to access more complex texts, even if they don't always know all of the specific tier 3 words. Okay, we just talked about a lot of things, and I want to take a little bit of time to just kind of wrap it all up and think about what does this mean for our practices as teachers, as coaches, whatever our role may be. So let's do a collaborate board one more time and just think about everything we've just talked about with knowledge building, its connection to equity, what research shows about how we retain and process information, and vocabulary. What does this mean for our K-2 literacy practices? What might we need to keep doing? What might we need to change? Take a minute to add some reflections. I'm seeing some great comments here. I'm going to call on one person. I figured out how to see names. So Helen, can you share, you shared about considering text sets as a way to build background knowledge. Can you share a little bit more about that?
Sure. When we're thinking about text sets, you're actually building, you're building knowledge within kids, and you've got a variety of sources that are there. Some are more easy, some are more difficult, and you're using those easier ones as a reading ladder to actually build to some more difficult concepts. And you're combining things like either books or maybe articles or small videos. There's just a wide variety of ways to build that background knowledge, and recognizing that, that'll make a huge difference for our kids. So stop putting books in quarantine.
Thanks for sharing. That kind of leads into some additional ideas here. So this is not an exhaustive list, obviously, but some of the implications for our K-2 literacy instruction could include, I'm going to start with what Helen just shared, this third one here, using text to deepen knowledge of a topic within a unit of study rather than covering a broad variety of topics. So for having kids kind of dig deeply into a certain concept or topic, reading maybe 10 different texts in a unit or module kind of about that concept, instead of what sometimes ends up happening, which is the unit might be focused on a skill instead of a concept. And then kids are just reading random texts to pull out that skill, right? So that could be one implication. Maybe we start planning our units or selecting texts based on themes, concepts, and ideas. Another implication obviously could be leveraging texts across disciplines to help students chunk information. Many of you said this first one, exposing our students to complex content and ideas by elevating science and social studies, which I'm gonna get on my social studies soapbox for a second. I've like dedicated the last decade of my life to social studies. I taught 8th grade social studies for a while. I had students who couldn't identify the United States on a map, who couldn't visualize, you know, when I was teaching about the 13 colonies, like they couldn't visualize in their minds how far away Great Britain is from the United States because they don't have like a mental map image, right? No amount of reading skills they learned in elementary school is going to help them fill those gaps. So exposing them to science and social studies content early on is so important. Okay, I'll get off my social studies soapbox. One thing that I wanted to dig into was this big shift down here on the bottom, which is the shift from starting with a standard or a skill and then picking a text to teach that skill, which is kind of how many of us probably operate, myself included, when I was a teacher, and shifting instead to starting with a complex text and using the standards in service of understanding the deeper meaning of that text or topic. So this could mean that when students are reading a text, they might be hitting several different standards, right? They might not just be doing one thing while they're reading. But that's kind of the shift that we're hoping to see. So let's look at kind of a comparison of 2 different classrooms, 2 different approaches to using nonfiction texts in a 2nd grade class. On the left-hand side of this table, you see an example of a skills-focused literacy classroom, which is what we've probably seen a lot of. And on the right hand, you'll see an example of knowledge building literacy classrooms. Take a moment to read over both, and then we'll have a quick conversation about it. Let's talk about it. For the sake of time, we won't do one more breakout room, but I'd love to hear, you can share your thoughts in the chat or just pop off mute and share whole group. And I'll go back to the other slide in just a moment so we can reference the lessons. But how do each of these lessons incorporate the skill of the standard? And then how might engagement differ in these 2 different approaches? So you can share in the chat or go ahead and just share whole group. I'm seeing some great reflections in the chat. And again, I feel like I'm like Helen's fan club right now, but I want to highlight what she shared in the chat, that if we like, it can be worrying to stick with just leveled text all the time, because we're being gatekeepers, sort of, right? Like we're not allowing our students to access more complex text and ideas and practice in those complex situations if we're just limiting what they have access to. So that can lead to some of those inequities. Does anyone want to share out, whole group, thoughts you're having about the differences, or any aha moments maybe you're having about the differences between these classrooms?
I kind of said in my chat, but it didn't make sense because I misspelled everything. But when we used to walk in classrooms and observe, and one of our deals was ask the kids what they're learning. And so we'd say, what are you learning today? And I'm hoping they would say, well, we're learning how to find main idea in detail. But really, now I want to hear, we're learning all about the different kind of whales.
And unfortunately, it goes back to what you were saying earlier with the assessment, because later on the assessment, when we say, what's the main idea? We need to have explicitly taught that, or they won't understand. And it's no longer assessing what what they're truly learning.
I was thinking similar thoughts with that, and how many conversations I've heard over the years about teachers worrying that if I use this terminology, but a different teacher uses another terminology about things like, I don't know, main idea or whatever, the kids won't understand what I'm talking about. And I just think, oh, what a missed opportunity. And I was also thinking too about, this is another, I think, Jared Miracle thing, but he talks about knowledge travels well. And in these times, I just think how much easier it is to also have a partnership with parents. If kids have to learn at home or learn remotely, if it's about reading books and it's about building knowledge, we don't have to rely on the parent to be able to also reinforce and teach kids how to find the main idea and the supporting details. And I just think it really builds that partnership so much better too. And it's just so much more engaging for kids.
Well, and I think too, we have to think about, why do we want them to be able to find the main idea in detail? Well, the whole point of that is we want them comprehending.
Yes.
It's not, main idea in detail is not a life skill per se. It's the ability to engage with the text and get the information from it. We've just given it a label. We've just called it something very specific, but that's not really, they're not gonna put that on their resume. I can find the main idea in details.
3 supporting details.
Right? Oh, I can do 4.
Yeah, those are excellent points. I have so many strong feelings about resumes. We can talk about that another time. But I love the way you guys framed that, and I love that you named that the point of teaching kids any of this is to comprehend what they're reading and like make meaning of it and apply it to whatever else they're trying to do, right? So I wanted to stamp that idea that like this Scarborough, I want to bring it back to Scarborough's rope again, right? The whole point of this is comprehension. That's the goal of reading, not like word recognition, and not just like kind of the green strands at the bottom. And I wanted to name what I think I heard a couple of folks saying. If we, in K2, just focus on processes and skills, and then suddenly in 3rd grade, or maybe even in middle school and beyond, we're asking them to layer on content or like knowledge understanding. What we're essentially doing is asking our kids to build a framework and an infrastructure in K2 that we then in 3rd grade and middle school and beyond ask them to break down and try to rebuild. We tell them one framework in one grade level and say like, oh, you'll add this layer next year. But then adding a layer later, adding a layer of like knowledge and comprehension later on is harder than just weaving it all into the process of how kids approach text the first time around. I'll pause there for a second. I think someone was trying to say something and I maybe cut you off.
I was going to say the only thing that I was thinking with all of this, when talking about, they have to be able to identify main idea and detail, knowing those words. It's not that we should focus on saying main idea and detail, but when we're teaching and, reading that text about whales and stuff, those words should just be part of our natural vocabulary when we're talking about the text. You say, oh, as we're reading this, the main idea here I can see is this, and these details kind of show me what is going on with this whale or whatever. We just use that vocabulary naturally as part of the description of the actual content the knowledge that we're trying to teach. And then they hear those words over and over again, and that just becomes part of their vocabulary then, and they get that understanding because they're seeing it in that knowledge format, if that makes sense.
Belinda, this is Marissa here. I absolutely love that comment. And I was thinking like the same thing. I think when we talk about knowledge building through text, sometimes we don't talk enough about the role of classroom discourse. I think if you really want to build this knowledge-rich classroom, you are always talking about the knowledge you're building. You're using these terms. You're not teaching as main idea and supporting details. It's just a natural part of your vocabulary. Sometimes I think the author's central idea is this. You use those different terms, and then it takes some of the pressure off to teach it in any certain way. There's this older reading research kind of during, when a lot of research was emerging around the reading wars, but Michael Presley, who's since passed away, he has in one of the articles, there's these little vignettes, and there are these really skilled teachers who intentionally use different opportunities that arise throughout the day to make connections to content. So even, helping a couple kids refill the classroom stapler becomes a conversation using some of the vocabulary from a science lesson where they were talking about metals. And so it's just the more you read rich text, the more you can find those opportunities to talk about things. So I know exactly what you're saying, and I appreciate it because I was just having the same thoughts. I don't want to take us over time, so.
Thank you all so much for your rich contributions today. I think it really was enjoyable for me as well as a facilitator to just have people really engaging in this conversation. And the ideas you are bringing to the table, the strongly held beliefs, make me just feel really excited about what's happening in your classrooms and what you're doing for your students. So keep fighting the good fight. We will close out with just one more reflection question. Please do respond to both of these questions before you hop off the call. What is one key learning from today that you commit to applying to your work? And then what wonderings do you still have about building knowledge and vocabulary through text? So once you've shared both of those things, you are free to hop off. Have a wonderful weekend and hopefully you get some time off next week. And thank you so much for your time and engagement today.
I thought I was supposed to respond to questions. Where'd they go? Oh.